Excited to welcome you again to the World Evangelism Podcast. This is your host, Austin Gardner, and I am excited to share with you more on the idea of praying for missionaries. As you know, yesterday I mentioned the fact that this young couple, it seems that 3 people were killed in Haiti. They were down there trying to serve God, trying to see people saved, see lives changed. And so yesterday we talked about how Paul asked for prayer. And we talked about how we were in a spiritual war, and we talked about how that there were unreasonable and wicked men. Well, Paul also in that same verse asked that their ministry would be acceptable. And so I want to ask you, as your second prayer request, if you pray what the Bible says, you're pretty well guaranteed to get an answer because you're praying what the Word of God says. The Bible says in Romans 15:31, that I may be delivered from them that do not believe in Judea, and that my service which I have for Jerusalem may be accepted of the saints. That's an interesting concept because it comes, verse 31, it comes with a whole lot of stuff. It comes in right after verse 30, which Paul said, y'all pray for me and pray with me about this. And now he comes along and he says, hey, that I may be delivered from them. That's all there in this strong verse. And so I want to just challenge you that we also want to pray that their ministries will be acceptable. Now, if you know anything about missionaries, you've watched them travel from church to church trying to raise support. They are trying to raise support from the saints. See, the ministry be acceptable to the saints. And they travel from place to place, and we're asking that what they preach would be acceptable. Do you understand how that might affect what we call deputation, or when they're trying to raise support? They come to your church, and they've been traveling for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, or they traveled all that time yesterday, and then they slept last night, and they're in a strange place, and their children are about to be expected to go to strange Sunday school classes with people they don't know. They got to separate from their mother. They've got to go to a nursery they've never been to. They're going to cry about having to do that, and it's going to be a little bit hard for them to accept. And so as we travel and try to raise support as missionaries, it's a stressful time. And so I would just like to say to you that God calls on his people, or the Apostle Paul calls on his people to pray that the ministry would be accepted by the saints. If you don't accept their ministry, if you don't get behind them, they can't raise their support. If they can't raise their support, they financially will not be able to go to the mission field. So I would ask you to pray for them that their ministry be accepted. I'd also ask you to pray for your pastor. Your pastor, as he goes up into the pulpit, walks up into that pulpit with a hunger and a desire to see God use him, but will it be accepted by the saints? And so many of us sit in the pews with a critical spirit and a critical attitude, rather than saying to ourselves, what can I do to pray for my pastor? What can I do to help him and to be a blessing to him? Pray that his ministry will be acceptable. Now, just because you preach Bible doesn't mean that it can and will get through. It doesn't mean that people will hear it and understand it and accept it. It doesn't mean that people will say, I got it. That's just not the way it works. We need the touch of God. We need the Holy Spirit to give us wisdom and power to be able to say and do that in a way that makes it work. So what they're doing needs to be done in a way that makes it acceptable. It's not just what you say, it's how you say. It's not just what you say, it's what they hear. And so I'd ask you to pray that their ministry would be accepted. Then I'd like to remind you that they're fixing to go to the mission field. They're on their way to a mission field, to another place, a cross-cultural ministry. And so now they've not only got the barriers of taking the Bible from a God perspective to people and people understanding it, but now they got to go from a God perspective, translate it through a different language to a different culture that they don't fully understand, and take the gospel to those other people. It's a cross-cultural ministry. And we have to remove every barrier that our background might cause for the kingdom. And sometimes I bring baggage into my message and baggage into my attitude and baggage into what I'm saying and doing. And we want to help the missionary remove that so he can be a blessing to the people that he'll be preaching to. It's a cross-cultural ministry. Some pastors and some missionaries never connect with the people. They preach the truth and they're good men and they love God, but they never connect. And when you don't connect, the message doesn't reach its intended person with the power it was meant to go with. I use as an illustration here a story I got off of the Andy Griffith show, I Believe. But I can't for the life of me find that story. But I call it the well bucket. And in that story, as I remember it, let me just say as I remember it, Opie sees this poor person that needs a new well bucket. And so he goes and buys a well bucket, and he goes up to this poor person and offers him the well bucket. And the guy says, "What are you trying to do? Treat me like I'm poor? Are you trying to treat me like I need you? I won't be beholden to nobody. I won't be owing anybody anything. You have no right to look down on me and think that my stuff isn't as good as your stuff." And Opie is astounded. He can't believe it. He wants to help. He goes to see his dad, and his dad says, "Well, son, you got to know how to give a bucket. You can't just give a bucket." And so he said, "Okay." And so they go back up, and Andy gets out of the car and walks over to him, and he said, "Son, don't come up here, Sheriff. Your boy's already been here, and I don't need y'all doing that." And Andy said, "No, I'm here to tell you I need to buy your bucket." And the guy said, "I ain't selling you my bucket." He said, "You can go down to the store and buy your own bucket." And Andy said, "But your bucket has character. It has something I can use. It's the kind of decoration I want because it's a bucket that's been used and has character and it says something. It's not just a general everyday bucket." And the guy said, "Look, buddy, I can't help it. Buy your own bucket." And Andy said, "That won't do." And he said, I can't help you, Andy. I ain't going to give you. It's the only bucket I got." And Andy said, "I got one of these buckets from the store, and it's just a brand new, common, everyday, run-of-the-mill bucket. It has no story to tell. It has no history. It's not that good. Could I trade buckets with you?" And the guy said, "Well, Andy, if it needs that much to you, I could do you a favor and trade buckets." And they got in the car and start down the hill, and Opie says, "Dad, I can't believe it." And Andy says, "You got to know how to give a bucket." And so a missionary has to learn how to cross that cultural barrier so that the person can receive the bucket, so they can understand the gospel, so that you know you're not coming at them like you're better than them, that you're there to help them. And so I want to challenge you to pray that God would protect the missionaries. And I want to challenge you to pray that God would help the missionaries, that their message would be acceptable. And then the third thing I want you to pray about and pray for is that they would enjoy success in their ministry. In Romans 15:32, it says that I may come unto you with joy by the will of God, and may with you be refreshed. See, the Apostle Paul wanted God to do a work in his life and his ministry that would help him to carry on long beyond what he was doing. He wanted to see God do a work. He wanted to see God open doors. He wanted to see God change lives. He wanted to see God make a difference. The missionary is going to be coming home on furlough, but can he come home happy? I have seen missionaries return from the field with their tail between their legs and their head hanging low and their feet dragging on the ground, and they're so discouraged. Many of them don't go back. They saw no success. They saw God didn't do a work in their lives and ministries, and they're very sad about it. Well, what if we prayed for them? I've seen many preachers go up to the pulpit, and they so desperately want to be used of God, but nobody's praying for them. Paul said, "Brethren, pray for me. Strive with me. Get involved with me." So would you pray that that missionary could come back and say, "Boy, God did this, and God did this, and God did this"? You see, we have not because we ask not. And this message is a message of calling you to pray for people and pray for you to care about the missionaries. You see, when Paul got through with his missionary journey, in Acts 14:25, when they had preached the word, they went back. And in verse 26, they sailed back to Antioch, to their home church, where they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they had fulfilled. They go back to where they came from, and the work had been done. Your missionary needs to return home feeling like, "I got the job done." There's a lot more to do, but I saw God move. Now, Paul's going to make more missionary trips, but he saw God move. And then look what he says. Verse 27, he says, and they rehearsed all that God had done with them. They rehearsed all that God had done with them. They rehearsed how God had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. And they stayed there a long time telling stories about the great things God had done. That's what we want your pastor to be able to do. We want your pastor to be able to walk out of the pulpit and say, you won't believe all God's done. You won't believe all God's done. That's what we want our pastor to be able to feel like when he walks out of the pulpit. That's what we want the missionary to feel like when he comes home. And it's so easy to sit in judgment. Well, did he get enough people saved? Is he worth the money we give him? And we never pray. We never pray. We sit in a critical judgment, but we never pray for him. I want to ask you to pray. Get in the battle with your missionary. Get in there and stand with him as he preaches and teaches. Get in there and make a difference through prayer. You see, Paul said in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 17, not because I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. Paul was doing it for Jesus and he was doing it for others. And I call on you to get involved and help them. I had a lady named Jean Smith, and Jean Smith loved us so much. I'd met her when I was a young kid. She was old enough to be my mother, and she had been going through a divorce, and she just needed somebody to show a little bit of love and appreciation for her. And the pastor called on me to do that at the altar in front of hundreds of people, and I just went and prayed with her. From there, she took me under her wing. She bought me every Oliver B. Green commentary there was. She bought me a red back Schofield Reference Bible. She wrote me a letter by hand every month until she died. She sent $10. She was always praying for me. I knew that if no one else was keeping up with everything going on in my life, Jean Smith was. She stood with me. I remember when Dr. Thurman Wade, who was the president of Macedonia Missions, I was in a conference and he held up a prayer card, and on the prayer card, it was all covered up. You could barely see the word Wade. And he loved that prayer card. And he told this story. He said this lady came to him at a missions conference and asked him if she could have another one of his prayer cards. And he said, well, of course you can. And he reached to get one. And she said, well, this one's all used up. And he said, how can you have a prayer card that's all used up? And she said, well, every time I pray for you, I put a hash mark. Then I come back and put the other part of the hash mark. And I've done that. And she had literally covered all of the card, front and back, except for his name. And he knew that meant she was in the trenches with him. She'd been praying with him. I challenge you not to be so critical. I challenge you not to be so quick to judge missionaries and question their fruit and question their ministry and question what they're doing. I challenge you not to do that. I challenge you to pray for them. I challenge you to imagine where they are. I challenge you to get out of your mind and into their mind. I challenge you to get out of your heart and into their heart. I challenge you to think about how you'd feel if you were living on the mission field. A long ways from your family, a long ways from your in-laws, a long ways from everything you know, a long ways from Walmart, a long ways. And you had to realize, I'm here to reach people for Christ, but I miss home. I challenge you to pray for them, that God would use them to do great and wonderful things. This is a mighty, strong prayer request, that God would do something with them, that their lives would count, that they would see God do something. That missionary wants to come home and say, I want to rehearse with you all God has done. I had a missionary come to me, and he wanted to take pictures of all my work so he could use that in his slideshow when he came back home. That's how far back that was. He would call me up and say, can you tell me how many people got saved? You know, I had part in starting that church. I need some numbers. He was padding his account. He wanted his supporters to feel like he had accomplished his job. He had to kind of feel beat. And I just want you to understand, what he needs is your sympathy and your love and your prayer, because it's God that enables the preacher. It's God that gives strength to the preacher to get the job done. You know that. Your pastor, how often does he carry all the burdens of all the people, and almost no one says, I love you, preacher, and I'm praying for you. I'm with you, preacher. How often does he get a text that just says, preacher, I love you, and I'm praying for you, and I'm looking forward to today's message. So I want to challenge you that you would pray that he would be able to come back with joy. He'd be able to get down out of the pulpit with joy. I want to challenge you to pray that God would use him in a great way for his honor and his glory. I want to challenge you to pray that his ministry would be accepted, that other Christians would get behind him. Sometimes when you're the pastor or the missionary, you feel like the Lone Ranger. Nobody's helping. Nobody's there. And nobody seems to care. But what if somebody prayed like Gene Smith? What if somebody stood with you and cared? What if you stood with other missionaries? I'm just challenging you to consider helping others do the work that God's called them to do. See, the Apostle Paul said, pray for me. If Paul needed prayer, how much more does the average missionary need prayer? Paul said, strive with me. Get in the battle with me. And I'm challenging you, instead of having this judgmental, what'd you get done, fill out this questionnaire to answer for what you've accomplished. Why don't you say this? I'm with you. I care. There was a time in my ministry when I returned to the mission field for the second term after my first term, and all my ministry was gone, but he was in the toilet. The pastors had all messed up. Everybody had fallen in sin. I was ready to quit. I called one pastor and I said, are you going to come see me? And he said, what about I see you? Whole ministry's falling apart. Okay. Thank you for the love and thank you for the comfort. I called this other pastor, Paul Forsythe. Paul Forsythe always loved me. And that's what I want to ask you to do. Paul Forsythe was always in the battle with me. He called me once a month, and he wouldn't even say who was calling. He'd just say, hey, buddy. And we'd start talking, and he'd talk 20, 30 minutes when it was costing $3 and $4 a minute to call. He did that once a month. And so we were talking on the phone. And I told him, I said, I'm thinking about quitting. I'm going to resign. I said, the whole ministry's falling apart. And he said, you ain't quitting, boy. I'll come down and kick your rear end. And I said, you don't understand. I really messed up. He said, no, you didn't. He said, every preacher that's ever been out there knows what it's like to fall on his face and have his church mess up. Everybody knows what it's like when things go wrong. And I know you've had a rough go of it, but the Lord's with you. You're going to stick in this. You're going to do the job. And I said, I don't know if I can. And he said, yes, you can. And he wouldn't quit. And he wouldn't let me go. And then he came to Peru and he preached to my guys and he cried and soaked his shirt with tears, loving my guys and helping me get them to get their lives right. He was with me. Of all the people of all the years, the one guy I always knew was with me. He's in heaven now. I miss him so much. But I would just say to you, do they know you're with them? Do the missionaries say, boy, this pastor's with me. This supporter's with me. He cares. He hurts when I hurt. The other day, a missionary's house was broken into and he was robbed of hundreds of dollars. How'd that affect you? Did you think about that? Did you consider how you might help? Did it break your heart? How would you have felt it if it was you? Would you have wanted a little bit of help? So I challenge you to consider what you might do to help, to get in the trenches, to pray for them. They're in a spiritual war. Everything's going against them. The devil's trying to discourage them. They need their ministry to be acceptable. They need people to accept it. They need to know how to give the bucket, remember? And they want to have success. They want to be able to come back and report all that God has done. And the only way they're ever going to be able to do that is if you help them. Would you help them in prayer? Would you get involved with them? I really call on you to do that. Well, I just want to thank you. I've taken a break from our normally scheduled stuff to share this about praying. I'm going to do that once or twice more. I may do an extra podcast because I want you to pray and I want you to know how to pray. But would you help me? Would you help me spread the word about this podcast? Would you put it on social media? Would you just say you enjoy it and invite others to get with it? Right now, we only have about 20 people listening, regularly downloading, but buddy, I really want to be a blessing. It is my heart's desire to inspire missions. It's my heart's desire to help people want to see the gospel go forward. It's my heart's desire to make a difference. I want it so much. In these last years of my life, I want to see God still make a difference with me. Would you pray with me about that? And would you help me promote this? If it's a blessing. If it's not, let me know and I'll try something else. Let me know what I can do to improve because we got a lot to do. Time is short. Many people need to be saved. Well, this has been Austin Gardner in the World Evangelism Podcast, and I am so happy to talk to you, and I look forward to hearing from you. Share this with others. God bless you so much.